Hey, this is Ian with iPhone Tech. Today we're going to be going over updating firmware on IX and IXG series devices. Keeping the firmware on your devices up to date is important for both security and to make sure you have access to the latest features. There's a couple different ways to do this depending on the configuration of your system and the current version of firmware you're running. For instance, if you're on firmware version 5 or below on IX series devices, you'll need to be using our Firmware Upgrade tool to get those devices up to date. Today we're going to be going over 3 different pieces of software: our IXG Support Tool, our IX Support Tool, and the Firmware Upgrade tool. Before you get started, download the latest firmware from our resource center on iPhone.com or follow the link in the description below. First, we'll start with the IXG Support Tool. This is compatible with all IXG devices and all IX devices aside from the IX-MV. First, in your IXG Support Tool, click on the View button at the very top and click Advanced. This is going to open up the Advanced menu on the left-hand column. Then at the very bottom, we're going to open Maintenance and then go to Firmware Update. Here in the Firmware Update window, you're going to see 2 different boxes. You will see the Select Firmware File box, where we're going to pick the firmware files we're going to use. Then below that, we'll see Select Stations to Update, which is where we pick our devices we want to update. When you're doing these firmware updates, we can pick multiple firmware files to update multiple devices at the same time and select every device in our system to get everything out of the way all at once. First, I'm going to go up to the IXG DM7 firmware, click Browse. Then I'll select my IXG DM7 483 firmware that I downloaded from iPhone.com earlier. Once this is loaded in, I'm going to go down to the bottom and pick my IXG DM7, and then click the Update button to start the firmware update. This firmware update process can take a few minutes. Be sure during the process you do not power down or unplug the devices, as it could permanently damage them. As you can see, the IXG DM7 is now updating its firmware. It'll take a few minutes to complete, and it may power cycle several times. Just be sure you get a complete notification in the IXG Support Tool before you do anything else with the device. Next, we're going to be using the IX Support Tool. The IX Support Tool is compatible with all IX series devices, but none of the IXG series devices. Today we're going to be updating this IX-DV. The process is going to be almost identical to what we just performed previously in the IXG Support Tool. First, in the IX Support Tool, go to the left column, down to Maintenance, and click the Firmware Update section. Here you're going to see the exact same 2 windows that you just saw in the IXG Support Tool. We're going to go to the IX-DV, click Browse, and then select our IXDV version 881 firmware. Once our firmware is selected, we can pick our IXDV from the window below, and then click our Update button. Lastly, we'll be using the Firmware Upgrade tool. Just like the IX Support Tool, it is only compatible with IX series devices and none of the devices from the IXG series. Today we'll be updating the firmware on this IX-MV7. When you first open the software, it's going to automatically search your network for devices. If you don't see any devices appearing during the search, make sure you have the correct network adapter selected in the bottom left. Once it's completed the search, it'll show every iPhone device it found on the network, and we can click Continue in the bottom right. Here, we can select which devices that the Firmware Upgrade tool found that we want to update firmware on. Once we select the device, it'll show us our current firmware version, and we can enter in the ID and password for that station. Once the ID and password have been entered into the Firmware Upgrade tool, we can click Authenticate in the bottom right to confirm that ID and password is correct. It'll show status available if you had the correct password, or unavailable if it was not able to log onto the device. Once that's done, we can click Continue in the bottom right corner again. Here, similar to what we did in the previous 2 support tools, we can click the Browse button to find the firmware that we need. Here I'll be picking our IX-MV7 firmware version 8. Once that's selected, we just need to click the Update button, which will update the firmware on the IX-MV7. Now that we've started the update, we can see the update status appear on our IX-MV7, telling us the progress. Now that our firmware update is complete, we see the notification pop up in our Firmware Upgrade tool. And with that, we've shown the 3 ways to update firmware on your iPhone devices. If you need any of the firmware or software we used in this video, you can find those in links in the description below. For any additional technical information or troubleshooting, visit the Technical Knowledge Base on iPhone.com. Thanks for watching.